Hello and welcome back to NV Fine Art Studio. I'm Nina and today we will be reviewing Paul Rubens' watercolor set. We will go through all the colors together. We will compare it to my typical set from Holbein, Daniel Smith and Winsor Newton. And then I'll do a little impromptu landscape to test it on a small scale painting. And then we'll do side-by-side proper large-scale painting with Paul Rubens paints and then my typical palette. And we will see if there is a difference and if this difference can be used for the benefit, or it can be something that you can adapt and ignore, because these paints are definitely much cheaper and I'm super excited to start testing them. I was sent these paints and also this paper from Rubens to review it. I wasn't paid for it, I was just asked to give my honest opinion. And I'm so glad I was given this opportunity, because I know so many of you ask for alternative paints to Daniel Smith, Winsor Newton, Holbein, because I know they are quite expensive and not many beginner artists want to spend that much, because there is a lot of practice going straight into rubbish bin. So it's basically almost like a waste of money. But I know it's never a waste of money, because every experience is an experience and it's your step forward towards mastering watercolor. So let's start with paper. It feels really good. It feels exactly like a 100% cotton paper from Bao Hong I'm usually painting on. It has a very nice texture. It actually has a bit of a sparkle on it, so I'm sure if you like sparkly effect, it's gonna be beneficial. This is 300 GSM. I believe it's a medium texture. It feels like it's a medium cold press texture, but just because everything is in Chinese on the packaging, I can't really say if it's 100% cotton or not. If you can read Chinese, or if you've painted on Paul Rubens paper before, please let me know in the comments. Thank you. So here's the paints, and this is absolutely beautiful packaging. I absolutely love the palette, the fact that it's metal and the fact that it's painted with white paint over it, so you can see clearly what kind of mixture you're getting. And also in the packaging there was a little cloth and also a list of all the colors, including pigment numbers, printed on Paul Rubens paper, so you can swatch it for reference. On the left I have Paul Rubens paper and on the right it's Bao Hong quarter sheet. Starting with Naples Yellow PW6, PY53 and PBR24. First impression, the paint is very soft. I've gently sprayed it, but I believe it didn't even need to be sprayed. The paint is so soft straight from the well. It's impressive. So far, I don't see much difference between Paul Rubens paper and Bao Hong paper, and also Naples Yellow looks very good. Obviously, we haven't tested much from just looking at the color itself, but the look of the color, it's vibrant. It looks very similar to other professional watercolor paints. Second color is Lemon Yellow PY3. It's a classical pigment for lemon yellow paint and it looks very similar. My first impression, it looks very similar to any other lemon yellow paint from any other brand. Next one is Cadmium Yellow Light PY35. Again, very classy PY35 pigment. Again, so far, no difference between Paul Rubens and Bao Hong paper. Very impressed with Paul Rubens paper, behaves very nicely. Now let's go a little quicker through all these paints, because this is pretty much a test of vibrancy, a test of the quality of paint itself, how soft it is, how it dilutes, how it goes from full saturation to full dilution. So far it looks really good and it's very consistent. So fourth is Chromium Yellow Hue Deep PY65, have Chromium Orange PO62. Next one is a Cadmium Red Light PR108, Perlin Maroon PR179, Quinacridone Rose PV19, Quinacridone Maroon PV42. Number 10 is Dioxazine Violet PV23, Indigo PB15 and PB66, French Blue. I believe this is a substitution to French Ultramarine. Pigment is PB29. Number 13 is Berlin Blue PB27. Number 14 is Phthalo Blue PB15. Then we have Translucent Turquoise PB16, Oriental Green PG7. Then we have May Green PY159 and PG7. Cobalt Turquoise Dark PG26, Olive Green Dark PO62 PG7, Yellow Earth PY42. I believe this is a substitution to Yellow Ochre or Raw Sienna. Then we have Burnt Sienna PR101 and PBK9. Burnt sienna usually just a single pigment of PR101, but in here we have Venetian red PR101, and I believe burnt sienna needed to be a little darker and browner, so it's almost like a mixture of Venetian red PR101 and ivory black PBK9. So number 22 is Venetian red, number 23 is brown umber, and number 24 is ivory black. Now let's quickly test staining properties and lifting technique. So far, first of all, I'm using my flat synthetic brush to lift, and so far I've just done a lifting on Paul Rubens paper, and it looks like it's actually cotton paper because it's much easier to lift from cellulose paper because paint usually sits on top and you just lift it and it's really easy. But if paint absorbs into the paper, it means paper has cotton. So far, all the yellows and reds and violets and blues, they look like they're not staining colors. Probably the only color that is a bit of has a bit of staining property is phthalo blue, but this is expected. Every single phthalo blue I know is a staining color. Also, it looks like number 21, burnt sienna, leaves a bit of a yellow behind, but again, it's not that much. So far, probably the only color that is staining is phthalo, and again, it's expected. Now I'm going to compare Paul Rubens colors to my typical colors from Daniel Smith, Winsor Newton and Holbein. First color, Naples yellow, looks a little opaque to me, so I mixed two colors, Jaune Brilliant one from Holbein and a yellow ochre from Winsor and Newton. Seems quite similar, but Paul Rubens a little more yellow and a little more vibrant. I'm going to completely ignore some colors because first of all I don't have 24 colors in my palette, it's only 12. The reason for it because I don't use them, I don't need them. So for example, I don't use lemon yellow in my painting, so I'm just going to ignore Paul Rubens lemon yellow. So next one is cadmium yellow light, and I'm going to compare it to cadmium yellow deep from Holbein. So Holbein paint, it's a mix of PO20 orange and PY35 yellow. So I'm going to actually mix yellow light and yellow deep together and see, yep, it's a perfect mixture. Yep, wonderful. I'm happy, very happy with this. But I don't use yellow deep too often in my paintings. I mostly use yellow ochre or gold ochre from Winsor & Newton, and these are the paints. So this is something that I want to get close to. So this is gold ochre, and this is yellow ochre. So let's see if chromium orange and earth yellow are close to these two. I think gold ochre and yellow ochre closer to earth yellow rather than chromium orange, but they're a little more intense and vibrant rather than earth yellow. I think earth yellow looks more like raw sienna rather than ochre color. Raw sienna is always a little more muted, more natural looking color rather than less bright, less vibrant than ochre colors. So I'm going to sample here raw sienna from Holbein next to earth yellow from Paul Rubens, and yet I think they look very, very similar. Although the pigments, they're different, PY42 for yellow earth and PY43 for yellow ochre. Now I'm going to compare burnt siennas. Burnt sienna from Winsor & Newton, my absolute favorite so far in comparison to any other brands in the market. Paul Rubens is using similar pigment as a base, PR101, but with a little bit of PBK9. So let's compare if they're any similar. As soon as I touch the paper in its full saturation, it definitely looks bright, and this is what I like about burnt sienna and Winsor & Newton. It has this absolutely amazing glow, rich, very, very rich brown, and I don't think you can match it because even in full saturation it's not as dark. And the only reason I use burnt sienna in my mixtures, if I want to substitute yellow ochre with a darker paint such as burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is a much darker paint in its full saturation, and I usually use this mixture. For example, if I mix yellow ochre with cobalt turquoise, I will use this as a medium tonal value at maximum, but if I mix burnt sienna with cobalt turquoise, it gives me an opportunity to mix middle and dark tonal values. For example, if I want to paint a tree, I would mix yellow ochre with cobalt turquoise to create a green, and I would paint the majority of foliage with this green. But if I want to paint shadow, instead of yellow ochre, I would use burnt sienna. So I would mix burnt sienna with cobalt turquoise, and I would get a much darker tonal value in comparison to mixing yellow ochre and cobalt turquoise. But burnt sienna in Paul Rubens is not as dark in its full saturation. So I would probably need to add some black or brown umber or something like that. Obviously it's not critical. You just have to know your colors and find the ways you achieve certain tonal values with certain colors. This is something that I got used to, but it definitely can be changed. Next one is cadmium red light. This is something that I use a lot in the mixtures. So in Paul Rubens we have cadmium red light PR108, and it actually looks very similar to cadmium red light Holbein. So let's check. The paint in the vial looks a little too dirty, so let's grab it straight from the tube. I've got a tube here from Holbein, so yep, it looks very, very similar. Let's check the pigment number. Yep, it's PR108, so it's same pigment number, and they look very, very similar. So we have warm red. Now we need to find a cool red. Cool reds that I usually use, it's either alizarin crimson from Winsor & Newton or rose madder from Winsor & Newton. Closest looking red is Perylene Maroon, PR179, and honestly I don't really care, I don't really use it that much, so any cool red will do in the mixtures. And they look quite actually similar. Again, the only concern is Paul Rubens isn't dark enough in its full saturation. It's not as dark as alizarin crimson or rose madder in full saturation. So rose madder and alizarin crimson is much darker, and this is something that will definitely affect the darkness of the tonal value of the mixture. So far I'm very happy with Paul Rubens paints. I'm actually quite impressed. Now I'm going to test paints that I cannot live without, the blues. The blues, I believe, are very, very important. And I have classy blues in my palette. I have cobalt blue. It's a little dirty. It looks a little dirty, so I'm going to sample it again. I want a pure tone. Yeah, it looks a bit better. This is cobalt blue. Then we have ultramarine blue from Daniel Smith. This is a classy ultramarine. This is not French ultramarine. French ultramarine doesn't granulate as much and a little more intense. So I decided to go straight from the tube. So it's a pure ultramarine without any other colors mixed into it. Next we have cobalt turquoise light from Holbein. And next one is phthalo blue from Winsor Newton. I don't use it often, so I have it usually in a tube, and if I need a little bit of phthalo blue, I usually squeeze it on the palette. And the last one is violet, Carbazole Violet from Daniels. Let's start with violet. So far, violet from Paul Rubens and Carbazole Violet look pretty much identical, and it looks like the pigment they use. Daniel Smith is using PV23, and it looks like Paul Rubens is using exactly the same PV23 pigment. Next one is phthalo blue from Winsor Newton. Let's see how it looks against phthalo blue from Paul Rubens. So far looks very, very similar. The intensity of color is exactly the same. And in regards to the pigment, they both use PB15. I can't find anything similar to cobalt turquoise light from Holbein in Paul Rubens range, so I'm going to skip that. Next one is ultramarine blue. Again, they look very similar. Paul Rubens probably a little warmer, a little more violet looking blue. But in regards to the pigment, they use both PB29. This very basic test, putting the colors next to each other, shows that the colors from Paul Rubens look very, very similar to the colors I got used to from other brands. But the probably most important test is to try and paint something similar with Paul Rubens paints and also with my paints from other brands. So let's paint something very basic, maybe sky and some sort of abstract version of a landscape under the sky. For the sky, I'm going to do a typical combination of some warm hues such as yellow ochre and jaune brilliant, maybe a bit of cadmium red light, and also blue clouds and blue part of the sky with cobalt blue, cobalt turquoise, maybe a bit of lavender, and also a bit of cadmium red light and alizarin. So this is the sky. On the left, we have Daniel Smith, Winsor Newton and Holbein palette, and on the right, we have Paul Rubens colors. So again, I'm going to start with the warm part of the sky. It's a mixture of some yellows and reds, very watery mixture. Now I'm going to add a bit of blue shadow for the clouds. So violet, bluish, grayish mixture for the shadow part of the clouds. Trying to repeat what I did with Daniel Smith, Winsor Newton and Holbein. Okay, now the blue part of the sky. I'm going to use, too intense. We need to grade down with red. So let's try this again. Yep, a little better, but a bit more red. To grade down, yep, that's better, but it's a bit too strong. So we need to bring it to lighter tonal value. Yep, that's good. So far, it feels very similar, except that Daniel Smith, Winsor Newton and Holbein, it feels like these paints, they grab onto the paper a little bit stronger and stay where I put them and just blend, the outline blends. But it feels like Paul Rubens just moves on the paper. So my board is at 30-degree angle, and it feels if I put paint at the top, it just slides down. So you don't have, so the entire area looks like a blend of gray rather than a soft gradient from slightly redder gray to slightly bluer gray to slightly yellower gray, something like that. And obviously we just painted the sky, so it might be an accident. So let's keep going and see if it's actually a pattern. Now let's add an imaginable piece of land. So let's start with yellow ochre connected to the sky, and let's see how they blend on paper. Let's do a bit of a gradient, mixing it with green on paper. So far it's very typical process for my Daniel Smith, Winsor Newton and Holbein paints, getting a little darker. It's all blending nicely as always. Now let's do some wet on wet, maybe with very watery violet and very watery alizarin crimson, and see how it all blends. It blends nicely. Okay, looks good. Very typical process, very typical result. Now let's test Paul Rubens. So starting with yellow ochre, similar mixture to yellow ochre. Sorry, I don't remember the colors by heart. Looks very similar. Now let's blend it with the sky. No, I think I blended it with water, just with water. Yep. Okay. I actually had to do a couple more brush strokes for it to start moving. Okay, now we need green, some sort of greenish mixture. Okay, looks good. Now let's get a little darker olivey green mixture for the very bottom. Let's spray this a little bit to help it move on paper. Okay, so far it's not blending as I wanted it to blend. I can clearly see the brush strokes, like yellow ochre brush strokes, then middle green and stronger green at the bottom. So I need to do a couple more sprays. Now let's do wet on wet with very watery mixture. It's definitely not behaving like I want it to behave. Let's add a bit of red. The color looks more intense. I don't mind that, that's fine, but the blending process, it's not happening on the paper as I want it to happen. It's not blending nicely with the rest of the wash. But it doesn't mean it's bad, it just means that I have certain expectations and they're not happening. So it means that you probably need different techniques with Paul Rubens rather than you need for Daniel Smith, Winsor & Newton and Holbein. But so far, if you do same techniques, the wash is definitely not as smooth, and the way the watery mixture pushed the previous wash out isn't smooth as well. So now I'm tasting splattering. Oops! Wow, that's very unexpected. So at this point, I've noticed that first of all, when you do splatters, this bead dries instantly instead of blooming and blending with the rest. And it literally dries instantly. As soon as I splattered this little red dot, it's dry. Also, it feels like when you paint wet on wet, your new mixture, when you apply it on wet surface, it pushes the wet surface out. So instead of blending and instead of getting controlled or uncontrolled soft edges, you just get these halos. So your second wash creates a halo around it instead of blending. So it's been a minute or two, and so far this dot is getting dry and dry and dry, and there is definitely clear difference between how the splatter technique works with Daniel Smith, Winsor & Newton and Holbein and Paul Rubens. And the last point that I've noticed, so when you rinse your brush with a lot of paint on the brush, the paint leaves a film on the surface of the water. So all this leads me to a conclusion that they use some sort of additive in the paint, maybe like alcohol, or I'm not sure what exactly, but it's definitely not something that I've seen in Daniel Smith, Winsor & Newton or Holbein paints. Because if I pick up Holbein cadmium red light and try to rinse it, it instantly sinks into the water and blends with the rest of the water. But if I pick up any paint from Paul Rubens, it leaves a film, and it's really hard to blend it with water. It just basically stays on the surface and then eventually it blends. Now let's do the splattering again. If it was an accident, no, it doesn't look like it's an accident. It definitely gives this, as soon as it touches the previous wash, the pure paint, it dries and leaves a very odd halo around that splatter. And so far, if we look at the final result, Daniel Smith, Winsor & Newton and Holbein paints, it looks like a very smooth, consistent wash, very blended painting. But if you look at Paul Rubens, it's not, the blending is not as consistent. There is a chance that that's something that you need to get used to or use different technique when you paint. But definitely, whatever tools you use, you need to get used to them. And if you buy this paint and you paint every other day, I'm sure you will get used to the result that you get with Paul Rubens, and you find your way to avoid the things that I'm getting. And just because I'm comparing it to the paints that I got used to, and I'm getting different result, and this is my first time painting with Paul Rubens, this is what I'm getting. So I'm using my old techniques to paint with Paul Rubens, but it doesn't mean that you can't achieve same result with Paul Rubens. It just probably you need to use different techniques with Paul Rubens. The last technique that I wanted to test before doing a major painting is a pouring technique. So I'm pouring a mixture of all the colors together, and now I'm going to add wet onto wet some other colors and see how it stays on the paper and how I can move it and if I can get a bit of a control. So on the left we have Daniel Smith, Winsor Newton and Holbein, my typical palette, and I started with a gray mixture of all the colors together, and I'm adding some other paints wet onto wet, and I'm going to move it on paper by tilting the paper in all sorts of directions. And by tilting I'm trying to control where the mixture goes, but at the same time I'm aiming to preserve the areas where I poured pure paint with a bit of a hint of that color. And this is the idea of tilting, when you kind of have an uncontrolled blended edge between the colors, but at the same time you kind of get a hint of that color in that same area. So this is exactly what I'm achieving with Daniel Smith, Winsor Newton and Holbein. So overall this area is all gray, but at the same time we get very blended edges between, for example, blue and pink, pink and cobalt turquoise and yellow ochre. Now let's do the same with Paul Rubens. Let's pour some gray onto the paper. Now let's add a bit of water all around it. At this point my board is 100% flat, and now I'm going to add the colors wet onto wet like that. So a bit of orange, a bit of cobalt turquoise, phthalo, sorry. I'm going to spray this, exactly what we did with Daniel Smith. The blue cobalt turquoise color is disappearing, so I'm going to add a little bit more of that color. Like that. At this point it feels like they moving a little bit too much without grabbing onto the paper, and this is something that we had a similar effect when we painted the sky. The paint just moved on the surface instead of grabbing onto the paper. But again, you get what you get, and you just get used to these things and you use it for your benefit. So if that's what you're getting with Paul Rubens, you definitely need to use it for your benefit. Doesn't mean it's bad or good or whatever. It's just the result that you get with these paints, and you need to get used to it and find a way how to use it for your benefit. Now let's try to do a proper painting with Paul Rubens. I'm going to use large mop brush to start with, and I'm going to start with a very liquid mixtures of yellow for the sky. So far it feels like I pick up same amount of paint with same amount of water, but I'm getting slightly more saturated mixtures, so they look a little darker that I got used to with my other paints. As you may notice, the sky on the right looks much more saturated and much darker than the sky on the left, and left is my typical palette. Now I'm going to pick up slightly thicker and darker tonal value mixture, and we're going to start painting the land, and I'm going to leave a couple of sparkles behind white of the paper. So far paint behaves nicely, reacts to spray bottle in a very good way so far, except that it's darker, a little darker, so the mixture, you need to pick up a little less paint because the paint looks a bit more intense, That's the only difference I noticed. Now I'm going to create a green mixture and start adding green, wet into wet, and we're going to get a little darker, closer to the very foreground to suggest the depth in the painting. So the land is done. Now I want to do a couple of splatters, and I'm aware that splatters may create dry patches. So the mixture for splatters is not pure paint this time. I mixed it with water and I tried to match the mixture, the consistency of the mixture, the proportion of water and paint in the mixture, very close to the mixture that we used for the very foreground, that green mixture that you see in the very foreground. And so far, if you match the consistency, it doesn't look like the paint causes any issues. I think it probably only happens if you use pure paint and drop it on a damp surface. And this is something that I talked before, that if you notice some shortcomings in the supplies that you use, you just need to adjust it. It doesn't mean that they're bad or anything like that. No, it means that you need to do something to avoid that shortcoming happening. Now I'm testing the lifting, and so far it works perfect, no issues there whatsoever. Now I'm starting my second wash, wet on wet, and this is where I'm starting to see the difference. The spread of the paint is a little bit too intense. It pushes the paint into wet surface in a very dramatic way. On the example on the left, where I use my typical colors, the edge is a soft controlled edge and blends with wet surface in a very predictable, consistent manner. But if you look at the example on the right, Paul Rubens, it just blasts in some spots more, very dramatically, than in others. But I'm painting background, and I don't really care about it because it will be painted over with, and also it's very wet at the moment, but when it dries it may not look like that. So at this point I'm not concerned. Now I'm going to start painting the foliage, the tree foliage. I'm preparing a medium consistency 50-50 water to paint ratio, so this is a middle tonal value. And I'm starting with the outline of the trees and then filling in the main shape itself. At this point, the mixture is way too transparent, so I'm picking up more paint. But the problem is with creating a thicker mixture, on one hand, it will cover more, it's not going to be as transparent. On the other hand, it will be darker, but I don't really want it to be darker. So here's my first concern, that at certain value, for example, at this point, I want it to be value 5. It is value 5, tonal value 5 on the 10 scale range. So it's middle value, but it's way too transparent. I can see the blue shining through, and it's not a very clean look. Especially if you compare it to the example on the left, to my typical palette, it has same tonal value, but it's not as transparent. The problem with having the mixture that is too transparent, that it might look messy when it dries. But again, I'm looking at it from a professional point of view, from the point of view when you're painting, it costs a couple of $1,000s. But if you're a beginner, I don't think it matters too much. The fact that these paints are cheaper and you don't worry about wasting them, you don't worry about chucking this painting into the rubbish bin if it doesn't look good, it's the most important part. The fact that these paints cost less, and the fact that they use natural pigments, and the fact that overall they look quite nice, it's probably the most important factor if you're a beginner. Because as soon as you start worrying about how much things cost, like paints and paper, you almost like putting yourself in a cage, and you start worrying about the final result, and this is definitely not the way to success. Here is another little difficulty that I came across. At the moment I'm painting with a very thick mixture, 70% paint, 30% water, so there is much more paint in this mixture than water, and I'm painting tree trunks and I'm painting them on damp surface, so there is a little bit of moisture on the surface around the background area. And at this point, the borders of the tree trunk, I wanted them to be a very minor soft edged, because this is sort of a middle ground that goes into the background, and just because we're painting a scene that is against the sunlight, against the very bright sunlight at golden hour, I wanted these edges to be a little bit soft, a little blended with the background. That was the reason for me painting with a very thick mixture on a slightly damp surface, but the edges are spreading way too much, and this is something that occurred when we painted the background. They started to disperse in a very dramatic way. But in general, I don't really worry about things like that, because there is in watercolor, many people think that you make a mark and it's final, but in reality this is a myth. You can do whatever you want. You're as free as a bird in the sky. So the way I adjusted this, I picked up my fully synthetic brush and I cleaned up the edges. I know the edge is not 100% soft, but at the same time it's not 100% sharp, so it's absolutely perfect for this part of the painting. And here's the result, 2 paintings side by side. I think they both look nice, and in regards to the paints, my conclusion is that Paul Rubens has some kind of additive, I'm not sure which one, but this additive makes it behave in a little more unpredictable way, but I don't think it makes the final result look bad. Because, as I said before, whatever the result is, you can adjust to it, you can get used to it, as long as you don't worry about the cost of the paint, the cost of your materials. This is the most important part, because you want to feel free, you don't want to feel pressured by the price of your supplies. And this is all for today. I hope you liked it, I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you learned something new today. This is all, until my next video, bye.